What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Week 3 Cash Game Review. We do every Monday here on YouTube for DFS channel. I'm your host TJ Hernandez with my co-host Matt Savoca. Let's just jump right into it. We only go for 30 minutes, so let's get down and dirty. Matt, how was your Week 3?
You know how you say in baseball, if you foul tip a pitch straight back, you were this close to a home
Yeah,
run.
yeah,
That's what this week was like.
yeah,
I know we're aiming for a median projection score when we're talking about cash game lineups, but I don't mean exactly 50th
yeah,
percentile.
yeah, man.
But that's where the FanDuel lineup ended up. If we can throw that lineup up there in one of the big tournaments where the top 16,000 scores wins, it was
Mhm.
exactly like 49 point something percentile, and
Yeah.
that's exactly what it showed in my head-to-heads and double-ups. 50% win rate this week, so about break even based on the amount I played this week. If you looked at the value rankings for the 4 for 4 value rankings in our lineup generator, these names were all near the top of the list. And I felt like there are a lot of things that I hit on that we'll get on in a minute, but there were a couple of areas where I definitely think I didn't take my own advice from last week,
Yeah.
which is to not overthink things, especially with that free square opening up in the afternoon, but in this unique way where they were kind of floating the idea of Dalvin Cook playing on a limited
Mhm.
basis. I do think I eventually got two in my head and didn't pivot when I needed to.
Yeah, the big well, I guess the two big things that swung cash games this week was Cooper Cup obviously going nuts again with 2 touchdowns, and then the Dalvin Cook Alexander Madison news. We got word in the middle of the night basically that it was unlikely Dalvin Cook was going to play. On FanDuel, it was pretty close to a free square. I don't remember the salary exactly, but I believe it was well below $6,000. On DraftKings, he was up
Yeah.
at 6K. Alexander Madison was, so it wasn't like a slam dunk because there was other value running backs around him. So we'll get into that a little bit. But that was the one big decision point, and there was some risk, like you mentioned, with like we weren't completely sure they were being a little. Their reports were a little bit ambiguous. Like you said, like maybe Dalvin will be super limited, which obviously you just don't want any back in that situation. And we love the passing games there, but we'll get into all of that. So let's here we see your lineup here. I mean, like you mentioned, there was values up and down the board. I don't think we're going to look at this lineup at all and say any of these picks are egregious. The one big one people will probably see is Robert Woods over Cooper Cup, but we'll get into that. But again, Robert Woods was popping on our lineup generator just as much as Cup. They were 2-3 or 3-4, depending on what time you looked at the lineup generator and slight adjustments to projections. But let's just get into some of your hits. Where were you at in terms of what you hit on? What you feel good about? What came to fruition for you?
Yeah, I think the last thing I said to myself as I closed the book on the main slate was that this slate is all about six teams, and that's the Rams, the Chargers, Tampa Bay, Minnesota and Seattle, and of course the Chiefs. And I do think that focusing on those six teams and then kind of worrying about everything else was pretty correct. Josh Allen and the Bills notwithstanding there. And I was banging the drum for Austin Eckler all week, talking
Yeah.
him about him as a must play in cash games. And outside of the obvious values, and we talked about Saquon Barkley just being fundamentally mispriced, and that
Mhm.
worked out for us well. Austin Eckler for me felt like, okay, you really read this week correctly, and just the Chargers offense in general, just being something we can rely on week in and week out. That's something that's really exciting. Obviously, Mike Williams, no one saw this amount of production coming in the first couple of weeks, but he's turning into a surefire play at this point. So nothing but excitement there about that offense in general. And, obviously, I knew that the Rams offense going against what many consider a really strong Tampa Bay pass defense wasn't something that I was scared away from.
Yeah.
But I'll get into it with my misses here. I knew that there was a fundamental difference between Woods and Cup, even though they were really close in value and in
Mhm.
terms of dollars, projected points per dollar, there was an amount of safety with Cup that I knew in my gut that I didn't let myself go for because
Yeah.
of the wishy-washy news of Dalvin Cook. So in general, I'm pretty happy with how I saw the week.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk a lot more about Cup and Woods, but I think especially on FanDuel, there is obviously whatever we say about the volume and the target shares, especially after seeing them pretty close to me too. I think it's pretty clear at this point that Cooper Kupp has a lot more touchdown upside, and that's weighted way more heavily on FanDuel. And again, going through your lineup and Austin Eckler and Mike Williams specifically, one thing that we've talked about on this podcast and just throughout Discord, we get questions a lot is like stacking in cash games. And if they're the best values, whether it's the same game or the same team, I think it's something we should be more than willing to do. And so I like seeing that you have Eckler and Mike Williams in there together. I think that's just a really good spot. And then obviously Travis Kelce too. So it's 3 players from one game in a cash lineup. You're targeting the games. You kind of talked about like you told yourself not to overthink it. You say you did. What did you overthink this week?
I just wrote about in our FanDuel cash game article this week. I did a Saturday night update when it looked like Dalvin Cook was a no-go. And I said that Alexander Mattison is our first true free square running back, at least on FanDuel, of the season. And then I didn't actually do it myself. Basically, as I started looking at the Pittsburgh-Cincinnati game, I got fixated on the fact that I thought that Cincinnati was going to win outright. And then in that game environment, I assumed that the running back would have a great performance. And I got the first part of that correct, actually. Cincinnati did win. But of course, they got a major amount of their production through the air. And so Mixon disappoints, the chalk in Madison hits, the chalk in Cup hits, and then suddenly I go from a really nice 1 o'clock games to a mediocre finish at the end of the afternoon games. Still, I really feel like from looking at game selection, I think I posted in the 4for4 Discord right before games started that I still felt like Kansas City and Los Angeles offered the most fantasy-friendly or the safest fantasy-friendly environment. That I consider a miss at this point. I mean, I think Tampa Bay, Los Angeles offered more upside, and Minnesota, Seattle didn't disappoint. And those were games that everyone was pointing to as the best fantasy-friendly games as well. So I do think I could have leaned a little bit more on the numbers in that regard. And like we hit on already, once you get to Madison, then getting from Woods to Cup, especially on FanDuel, was really, really simple. So I could have had a simple 2-off and changed those 2 out, and I would have been up near the 80th percentile in my lineup with just those 2 things. So like I said in the beginning, it was a really close week. Feel like we had a really good read on it, but it was right there for us. We didn't quite get there.
Yeah, I mean, these cash games. I mean, one of the reasons it's tough to beat them is because these scores feel very fragile, right? A lot of times you're looking at the lineup that is at the top in your lineup, and it feels like a lot of times we're 1v1 or 2v2 with those lineups. A lot of times we are, and that's why we implement head-to-heads into our contest to smooth out some of that variance. And when you have 3 games like we did, the Chiefs game, the Bucks game, and the Vikings game, it's hard to nail down which one they are. They're all supposed to be really good environments, right? So in retrospect, I think it is easy to look at these things and say that's the one we should have been targeting, and maybe there's something to be said to putting more weight, just if when we do have 2 or 3 or a coin flip situation, just putting more weight into the late one just because it gives yourself more outs. Maybe that's something we could be thinking about more. But I mean, again, I don't like, outside of like in retrospect, I think maybe Cooper Kupp. I still don't even know if Madison's that egregious to leave off. Just because, I mean, we've seen him in these spots before not get the workload we expect. But outside of switching to Kupp and Madison, is there anything else just from a pure process standpoint that you switch up in week 3?
From a pure pure process standpoint, I saw the Bills as touchdown favorites. And I think I just kind of assumed that that would be a more defensive battle, but we know what the ceiling is for this Bills offense based on the 2020 season. It was really good to see them just get out to this commanding 21-0 lead. And then from there, the game got weird. There was some weird windy plays, but ultimately it was just great to see the Bills be this highly productive offense that we saw for much of last year. And besides that, not really. I think we saw just value running backs eating chalk where it was appropriate, and I could have done a little bit better once I was put in that position to react to that Madison Cook news.
Yeah, I have more thoughts on that Buffalo game from the other side, and also your second point. It was just if you're hitting optimize on a lineup generator, you're having a pretty good week the last 2 weeks. Did you get a chance to look at lineups that finished ahead of you? Did you notice any trends in lineups at the top of double ups, 50-50s, or your head-to-head games?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of afternoon chalk. Really, a lot of these high ownership players in obviously good spots did great. And so at the end of my 1 o'clock games, I was like, oh, wow, we could really have something here this week. And by the end of the 4 o'clock games, because I didn't have a lot of that 4 p.m. chalk, it didn't go as I expected. But as you mentioned before, just being when you have those toss-up situations, leaning on afternoon games just because of the optionality, it giving you more information heading into the afternoon game on what you have to do. And the Cardinals D was a situation I noticed this yesterday morning, and I just didn't have any of it. That's more of a oh wait, man, I wish I would have trusted my gut, but that is something that worked in tons of the top lineups.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on the Raiders D because we got some questions about them Sunday morning in our GPP show, and my only concern about the Raiders defense was I just didn't know if Jacoby Brissett was going to give them many scoring opportunities from a fantasy perspective. I mean, they threw a decent amount. The Dolphins did, even though they got up big early. It's just I didn't know if Jacoby was going to push the ball down the field, have interception opportunities. We've seen him be a pretty conservative quarterback, and that kind of came to fruition. I mean, obviously the game flow didn't go like we expected at all, but just not a lot of opportunities there. Any last thoughts on FanDuel or your week in general for cash?
Yeah, I think we're just trusting the 4-for-4 projections here. I realize, like just as you said, hit and optimize on a generator this week probably helped you out a lot, and that'll not always be the case. But
usually not.
We're staying the course here.
Yeah. No, I mean, again, it's like if our player pools are tight, and this doesn't even just go for us as content creators, but if you're building lineups and building teams and your player pools are including the guys that are smashing and you're just not putting it together. I mean, that's kind of the nature of the beast. Like, there's only so many combinations we can have, especially if you're playing one cash lineup like you and I do. You're going to have those weeks. DraftKings, we could switch over to that. I was kind of like you, also not on the didn't fit in cup, and then CH was the free square on the proverbial free square on DraftKings. Alexander Madison was priced up at 6,000, and he was kind of around these Joe Mixon, Saquon Barkley. I think Chris Carson was priced there as well. So it wasn't an obvious spot for Alexander Madison. I don't think he was a must-play in cash games, and his ownership wasn't nearly as high in cash games. I think in the big double up, he was somewhere around 35%, which for a cheap running back on in a cash double up, that's not that high. I mean, it might sound high if you're playing tournaments or something, but 35% is not high. You get a lot of players around the 50% range in a large field double up. That's pretty normal. Kind of like you, I was just slightly below that, like 50% range, not profiting one a little bit over 40%, depending on which size double up you were in. The cash lines ranged from like 150 to like 156, depending on how big or small the games were. I didn't have any late swap in this lineup, and kind of like you, I was sitting pretty going into the 4 p.m. games, and still had Woods, Mike Williams, and Chris Godwin. So I knew that Cup would be in a lot of lineups, and I knew that Madison would be in a fair amount. I wasn't sure how CEH would be on, because I don't think even though he was popping in medium projections, and probably on any site you were looking at, there was a lot of negative bias towards him because of his late fumble on national TV, and just because we didn't know if his workload was going to be guaranteed. We saw Darrell Williams stealing some goal line touches and touchdown opportunities. So I don't think he was necessarily a free square despite his price tag, even though it worked out. But I was sitting there with Godwin, Williams, and Woods, 3 players that have pretty good projections and sitting comfortably in 50-50s and double up. So I didn't think there was much late swapping to do. So I hit on, obviously, Mark Andrews, Mike Williams, and then I guess you could call Chris Godwin a hit, a little bit above projection, but 20 points from your slot. And I would say that another one of my hits on DraftKings was, even though we got late Dalvin news, depending on how you felt on CH, I still think wide receiver in the flex was correct. It was closer than last week, but a lot of lineups that I saw used wide receiver in flex, and I think the wide receivers were still projecting so much better as a group than running backs that it made sense. And I think it was a fine build. My misses, obviously, no CH, no Madison, compared to like the thought process there, especially with Madison, was that I had these other running backs that we were already pretty confident in a similar salary tier, and also it was the passing game of these offenses. Like, I wanted to figure out ways to get access to the passing game. Now, obviously, in retrospect, KJ Osborne, if I'm going to go out of my way to get passing game over Madison, probably shouldn't be KJ, but that was kind of my thought process there. We talked a lot about Cup versus Woods leading into the week, and their target shares getting closer, and just the way I built. It wasn't easy for me to get Cup here. And again, if Cup only scores once instead of twice, I mentioned those cash lines, like I'm cashing like a fair amount of my 50-50s and double up. So I'm not like justifying the decision, but again, that's kind of how close these decisions can be sometimes. And I think another one of my misses is more just kind of a theory, non-DFS kind of mental side. Like I think we talked about it. I don't remember if we talked about it on regular DFS MVP or here, but the mental side of it. I was house sitting and dog sitting, and not like in my element, and even though I was doing my normal amount of studying and prep work, I just wasn't as laser focused as I usually am. And in this game where we're pushing super thin margins, and playing against a lot of really sharp people, and you have to be making as many optimal decisions as you can, I think I should have just dialed back my money and play in general, even though it wasn't a horrible week. Like, when we're out of our loop a little bit, and you actually brought this up before the podcast, and we weren't even planning on talking about it. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because, like, in retrospect, I just wasn't completely focused. I was taking care of a dog that I'm not used to taking care of. I was in a place I'm not used to being. I'm like not in my normal setup, my workstation, and not dialed into my normal process, and that throws you for a loop a little bit. Like, it just doesn't feel as comfortable. When are you dialing? Are you dialing it back on spots like that?
Heck yeah, I am. I mean, this is a mental game. This is a game about making decisions. As much as we think it's about football and it's about the players that are on these that are related to these salaries, this is a game about making small decisions better than our opponents, more so over time than they do. And we're obviously going to make mistakes based on the variance of the game that we're playing. But if we are not mentally able to make the best decisions that we are, we're actually, that phrase that they talk about, garbage in, garbage out, where they talk about data and data analysis and things like that. You're doing that to yourself when you make suboptimal decisions, when you are in a suboptimal state. Not to say that you were in a suboptimal state, but you were not in your normal zone.
Yeah, no,
And
I mean
you know,
that's
I had a similar
suboptimal, right?
situation. I guess so. And, you know, I was in a similar situation. I had, you know, a loved one who had a birthday this week, and my attention was more focused there
Mhm.
than on DFS, as it should be. And
Yeah,
so I ended up playing in a different level of contests in tournaments than I would like to on a normal week, even though I felt like I had a good read on the slate. You know, I actually, this is unrelated, but I think it's worth bringing up. I was talking to a friend of mine who he's a really good chess player himself, but he also teaches chess as well to a lot of young people. And he teaches them the concept of either moving away from the board or closing your eyes,
yeah,
working on your breath, things that are not necessarily focused on move selection or even winning the game. It's about getting your brain in the right place to execute these decisions, especially when we're talking about, you know, the projections can't help us, the value metrics can't help us at this point. It's true toss ups. And, you know, the other thing I want to bring up is if you're running lineup optimizers and generators this week, especially on DraftKings, it was often popping with players like Osborne. I saw a lot of Cole Hardman as well. And it can sort of exacerbate your misses when a player like Osborne doesn't hit, but a player like Hardman,
yeah,
who in reality had the same probability of hitting as Osborne, does get that touchdown, does hit,
yeah.
and
And
does
wasn't
get
this
that
touchdown or
validation
wasn't this
just
touchdown a
because.
rushing touchdown on top of
Yeah,
it?
at this point, like it's obviously we're playing a fluky
Yeah,
game, so we can't say, well, if it wasn't for that fluke thing that
right, right,
happened, you
right.
know,
Yeah,
things would be different. But at the same time, we can't double count it. We can't say, hey, our decision was uh, wrong process and factually incorrect. It was only one, and we end up actually hurting ourselves more if we're not in that right state to take in and review things as well.
yeah. Yeah, I think like in retrospect, especially Sunday morning, where I'm like not where I'm used to being, and also dealing with injury information and updating everything. It's like that's when I really started feeling it, and that's when I think I even even after that, I started firing it more head to heads, and that I think that was where I'm like, what do you? I'm just firing action to get action. I think that's always a really big lesson. I won't get into too much of what worked in winning lineups because it was very similar on FanDuel and DraftKings. That isn't always the case, but it really was just being pretty balanced, trusting the top values when they are clear top values, not just blindly looking at an optimizer, but when we have clear top values, trusting that. It was just it was a week where when those values came up, we should have been paying attention to them. And again, even with all that, still for you, pretty much break even. I'm one Cooper Cup touchdown instead of two away from having a profitable week. So it is what it is. I don't think I think there was a lot of lessons to be learned, and there's still a lot of weeks left. Let's get into a big, broad overview of the week. Fantasy, DFS, real football. What jumped out to you this week?
I don't want anything to do with the Giants or the Falcons
Yeah,
offenses anytime soon.
yeah,
I mean, we thought there was going to be some fantasy goodness here, and we got bailed out by a Saquon Barkley touchdown. But, like,
mm-hmm.
especially if these Giants receivers are injured for any extended period of time, I guess maybe Daniel Jones has a little bit of upside just because he's going to have to run the ball more, but I don't think I want anything to do with them. And
Yep.
what can you say on the other side of the ball? Even though they won the game, we thought Calvin Ridley had wide receiver one overall potential. That's out the window right now. Kyle Pitts, I mean, there's probably more potential there just because the tight end position is so volatile, but he doesn't look like he's immune from that tight end volatility in terms of opportunity or production. And then it was incredibly tilting to see Lee Smith score instead of him. And I do think that the quarterback position is, you know, mid round or mid tier quarterback is certainly not dead. I think we've talked a
Mm-hmm.
lot over the course of this season about how these rushing quarterbacks offer a ceiling projection that we really haven't seen, and that the idea of the late round or the low tier quarterback is dead. I think we're overstating that a little bit, especially with these like Tom Brady, Matthew Stafford, not necessarily priced at the very top of their position because they don't rush. So I think we're going to run into these situations where um, I mean, we both played Lamar Jackson. He was popping in all of our value
Yeah.
rankings, but ultimately he was only the 12th best quarterback on the week. So, we could have made different decisions there, and I think ultimately, like, great passers in great situations and with high Vegas totals, we shouldn't be going away from them at all.
Yeah, there was a lot of Matthew Stafford in high scoring cash game lineups on DraftKings, and I think it's a lesson in what is it doing to your overall team. Like we talk about not getting focused on, like, we should be focusing on the entire lineup, and I still do think that the rushing mobile quarterback is probably one of the most important safe plays in cash games. But if it's taking away from what you can be doing elsewhere in your lineup and raising the overall floor, I do think we need to be cognizant of that. I kind of, like you talked about the Giants. I mean, a week ago, they were running it up and down the field on Washington. Week one, we saw Justin Herbert drop 330 yards on Washington. This was supposed to be the best defense in the league. And then Josh Allen just goes full 2020 on them. Shout out to the Bills. They're back. I think they're going to go on a hell of a tear right now. I think that was a combo of Bills being really good. But Washington defense, they might not be anywhere close to the defense we were expecting. Justin Fields falls completely flat on his face. That was a combo. The Chicago offensive line just didn't take that into account enough. I mean, I knew the passing wouldn't be good, but I figure if I can get.
But that game plan from Chicago was terrible.
Terrible. But I'm sitting here thinking, listen, because I did use Justin Fields in quite a bit of other lineups on DraftKings, if I can maybe get 50 or 60 yards on the ground, he falls into a touchdown. Anything he gives me through the air is going to be a bonus. I mean, you're not expecting to get like a straight up zero through the air damn near. So that was bad. Najee Harris getting 14 catches. What the hell is that? Baltimore barely getting it done with Latavius winning the touch battle against Tyson Williams. And I'm not even worried about Baltimore. I mean, I had a lot of Lamar, so I was watching that game really closely. They had drop touchdowns left and right, penalties, a couple just like super not characteristic Lamar, like scrambling, taking a sack without throwing it away. Like just a couple weird plays. Like that game could have easily been 40 to 16 instead. They just left a lot out on the field. And then why are we still using Melvin Gordon? That's just me being mad that I had Javonte and it didn't pay off with a strong start.
The Jets are unwatchable television.
Unless you're playing, the only way to watch the Jets is to play your fantasy players against them, and then you can just root against them, and it's fun. Go Cortland Sutton. Let's take a look at everything we just talked about, and how are you applying that to your process going forward? Like any big changes that you're going to make this week, or just that you are going to make overall with what we just saw?
Nothing big here. We're still working on nailing game selection, because there are going to be weekends where the fantasy-friendly environments reveal themselves, and yes, we're going to have to make decisions within them, but the more we can just get better about understanding that game environment dictates the way that almost all of the players in that game environment do as in terms of production. That's something that we're personally been really leaning into this year, and I'm going to keep on that train. Not really anything else in terms of big process changes.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about some pretty big ones early in the year, and they'll be, as we get later into the year, the process changes or the adjustments will hopefully get smaller, a lot smaller. So that's natural. I mean, this kind of goes back to like the mental game approach and just kind of being not in your normal element. I mean, one thing that I've really fell into the trap of this week was having tunnel vision and not adapting to late news. Again, I mean, I don't think if I play that slate 100 times, I think I'm fading Madison, and on DraftKings with his pricing, probably 97, 98 times with how that pricing worked. But I mean, I just got so locked into wanting Lamar and wanting his upside against that defense that I kind of let everything else build around that instead of building around the lineup as a whole, like we've talked about. And then the game situations, like even though I don't think I'm getting Madison, I was so like convinced that I was just on the passing games of these offenses that I didn't take into account enough. And then another thing that this usually never happens to me, and again, a reason I think I should have dialed it back, just not being completely focused, is conflating my exposure of players across cash and GPP. Like for a lot of the week, I had either Fields or Lamar in my cash game lineup, and I ended up using Fields in one of my big single entry tournaments just because the reason doesn't matter. I just wanted to play a bunch of high price pass catchers. But seeing Fields in my big single entry and then all of my cash lineups were just like, do I want this much overall exposure to Fields? I shouldn't be thinking that way. Like I should be thinking separately, like what is best for this lineup? What is best for this lineup? Does it get me to cut with him and make up the points elsewhere? It's impossible to say because I don't know what the build would have looked like. I think I'm more likely just to go way balanced and not have a KJ Osborne there if I go with the field. So I don't know if I ultimately land on him, but just like even worrying about having exposure in both spots, I think is a pretty bad process. And then something we haven't talked about, factoring in ownership into cash games. I downloaded the big double up for DraftKings, and Cooper Kupp was in almost 70% of cash game lineups. So even if I think Woods is slightly better because he was, I think, $1,100 cheaper on DraftKings or something, if Kupp's going to be in 2/3 or 3/4 of the lineups, which in retrospect probably should have had a pretty good read that like he's the only guy with the ownership projection near 30%, so he's probably going to be in 60-70% of double up lineups. There's not much reason for me, even if I think like, well, he needs to score. Like if he doesn't score, I'm fine. I'm not losing much on the field if he busts because everybody has him in cash games. We don't need to be that different. CEH and Madison, they were in a lot of lineups too, but it's easier to make up. Like they were in 40% of the field, and their scores weren't like blowing running backs away. But it like maximizes your number.
That was a big difference on FanDuel.
Yeah.
Sorry, Madison was 71% in this big one.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and so if I'm going into it thinking about players that are going to be in that many lineups, if I don't have a reason to be completely cold on them, like just kind of go with the field on that, because if that guy has a bad game, you're not losing much ground. So I think those points like are things that I should be more cognizant, and usually am way more cognizant of. Like I've had so many weeks where I have, if I'm playing just a couple big single entry lineups in cash, there's plenty of players that I have 100% exposure to. I'm not playing 100 tournament lineups every week. So yeah, those are the things that I kind of wish I would have been more cognizant of. We're a little over 30. Any last thoughts on the week before we get out of here?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and we can just say, as we do in season-long fantasy football, the wisdom of the crowd can help us in cash games. If someone is at 2/3 expected ownership in cash games like a Cooper Kupp or on FanDuel Alexander Madison, we don't need to differentiate ourselves that way in cash games. Have fun fading him at 100%. You don't have any lineups with them in tournaments, because think about what happens if that player fails and players on your lineup see. That's where we want to use leverage to our advantage. We don't need to gain leverage that way in cash games. Yeah,
definitely. All right, awesome show again. This is turning into my favorite part of the week because it makes us turn the mirror on ourselves, and it's good. I think it's good for us, definitely good for the listeners, and hopefully you guys are getting a lot out of it. If you do enjoy this, please like the video on YouTube and follow the 4for4 channel. Also, please check out our other shows every Friday, 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time. Regular DFS MVP. We're going an hour early this week, 2 p.m. Pacific time, 5 p.m. Eastern time this Friday. Every Saturday, Yahoo DFS values with Matt Harmon. That is on the DFS MVP feed as well as the Yahoo feed. Sunday mornings, subscriber only, 4for4 subscriber only Discord show. GPP Last Look with Jordan Vanek. That's 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time. Make sure you join the Discord after you get your 4for4 subscription. Follow us on Twitter 4for4 is at 4for4 football. Matt is at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys on Friday.